If you guys love photography gear as much as I do, then this lens here is probably on your dream list to photograph with. This is the Canon EF 400mm f2.8L IS Mark III. And I'm gonna start right now. Announced back in December of 2018, this lens here is incredibly expensive, being one of the most expensive lenses I've ever reviewed on this channel, coming in brand new at over £13,000 or around $12,000. But it does offer you a few features that basically no other Canon lens offers you. So if you are a professional wildlife or sports photographer, is it actually worth a spot in your camera bag? This lens here is made of a full metal construction with a metal lens mount. It also boasts some of the best weather sealing money can buy. So it doesn't matter if you're going to the polar Arctic or maybe on a sub-Saharan Africa safari, this lens here is going to be able to withstand the harshest of conditions. So on the side of the lens, you've got a ton of switches. You've got an autofocus to manual focus switch, as well as 3 focus limiting modes. You've also got an image stabilization switch, and again with 3 image stabilization modes, as well as a focus preset switch with a set button and a focus actuator. This allows you to focus to a set point and then reset that every single time. You just need to simply flick the actuator, as well as you've got 4 customizable buttons right at the front of the lens. You've also got a giant focus ring, which is full-time manual focus with a focus window. And then obviously, due to the size of this lens, you also get a really nice tripod collar, and it's got 90-degree clicks. So it's really nice when you attach this lens to a tripod, for example, you can easily click from landscape to portrait orientation really quickly. It's also got this really nice kind of rubberized kind of handle, so you can actually carry the lens really easily. Now inside the box, you also get this giant lens hood, which is great to protect the front element from the sun, because look at the size of that front element. It is massive. Now, due to the size of this lens, you obviously can't use a filter, but that is where you can use the small 52mm drop-in filters that are the rear of the lens. So if you do want to use maybe a circular polarizer filter or a neutral density filter with this lens, maybe you want to use this lens for video, then simply buy the 52mm drop-in filters, because obviously, look at the size of that front element. There's no way you could get a filter that size. And talking about elements, this lens actually has quite a complicated optical formula, as you can imagine, with 17 elements in 13 groups. But what's nice over the previous generation 400mm f2.8 is the lens optics are more evenly distributed throughout the lens barrel, so it's not as front heavy and far easier to hand hold for long durations than the Mark II. And talking about size and weight, this lens, as you can see, is massive. But what you might be surprised to hear is actually it's the smallest and lightest 400mm 2.8 currently on the market, far lighter than the Sony lens and far lighter than the Nikon lens. This lens here comes in at just 2.84 kilograms, where the Sony lens comes in at 2.95 kilograms, and the Nikon lens comes in at 2.9 kilograms. And in fact, it's 1 kilogram lighter than the Mark II Canon 400mm f2.8. So if you are after the smallest and lightest 400mm f2.8, then this is by far your best option, although not by much. But there are plenty of smaller lenses, you'll just have to sacrifice the aperture, which is one of the best features of this lens. Now, a 400mm focal length is actually a really nice focal length to shoot with. It's a really nice crop and compression when it comes to sports and wildlife. Now, when it comes to wildlife, I probably recommend shooting slightly larger animals. For example, I was shooting red deer as well as grey seals, where if you're photographing smaller animals like birds, for example, they may get lost within the frame just due to the crop and compression of this lens. I'd probably recommend a slightly tighter crop, maybe a 500mm or ideally a 600mm for bird photography. But if you're photographing larger animals like myself or even people when it comes to sport, a 400mm focal length is a really nice focal length, and I actually preferred it over the 500mm and 600mm lens that I reviewed last year. Now, the f2.8 aperture in this lens is going to offer you so many benefits. Firstly, it's going to be great in a low light environment. I went out and photographed at dawn, so there's not a lot of light, and I was able to photograph fairly fast shutter speeds, making sure that my images are nice and sharp, as well as my ISO was not that high, where any other lens, I'd probably have to shoot at maybe 1000 or 2000 or even 4000 ISO to actually expose my photo correctly. With this lens here, I was able to shoot around 500 ISO, meaning I'm not going to get a lot of grain in my images, as well as it's going to offer you beautiful foreground and background separation with amazing background fall off. But what was the best feature about this lens was the contrast between the sharpness and the bokeh. This lens is incredibly sharp and basically sharper than any other lens I've used with a similar focal length. Far sharper than basically any other zoom lens, and far sharper than some prime lenses that I've used, like for example the EF 400mm f4 or the EF 400mm f5.6. If you're interested in either of those reviews, make sure to head down to the link in the description. Now if we have a quick look at the sharpness graph image, we can see we're getting great sharpness in the center, wide open at f2.8, but what's really nice is the sharpness is still there in the corners. So this lens is incredibly sharp wide open and only gets better when you step down to f4, 5.6 all the way to f8. But the image does start to soften beyond f16, and this lens can go down all the way to f22, where the image is quite soft. Now, I did go out and photograph the sunrise, and I actually pointed this lens directly towards the sun, so I just wanted to test the flaring, and actually it had pretty good flaring. Now, I must say the lack of contrast was quite bad, but there was no ugly color flaring. There was no blue or magenta color flaring appearing in any of my photos or videos. So that's a really good sign. All you'll have to do is fix the contrast in post to bring back some of that information found in the shadow regions. And also distortion and vignetting was basically non-existent. Now there's a small amount of distortion, a small amount of pinkish distortion, but that's basically not going to be noticeable even if you have the profile corrections turned off, as well as there's a small amount of vignetting wide open at f2.8. But that basically disappears when you step down to f4 or 5.6. So what I do recommend is turning on electronic compensations to fix any optical issues. This lens basically has none, so it's not going to degrade your image quality in any way. The only thing that I could see being a problem when it comes to image quality is the macro or minimum focus distance of this lens. It's not that great. With a minimum focus distance of just 2.5 meters with a maximum reproduction ratio of 0.17. Now close-up image quality was really good, but your subjects do have to be a fair distance away to actually photograph them. I actually struggled to photograph my macro tests because the room that I was photographing in was not big enough. But as a sports and wildlife photographer, I don't think you're going to run into an issue. All of the animals that I was photographing, you need to be a good distance away, like for example red deer or even grey seals. So the minimum focus distance of this lens is not something I don't think a lot of photographers are going to worry about. Now the autofocus of this lens is absolutely amazing and great in a low light environment and really reliable both for photography and video thanks to the USM motor that Canon have used with this lens. Now grant you, it's not the fastest autofocus system I've ever used. It's a great DSLR lens, but I think a lot of modern mirrorless lenses are far faster with newer technologies and newer autofocus systems. But for a DSLR lens, I think it's very reliable and probably one of the best ones you can buy. And it's the same situation when it comes to image stabilization, coming up to with 5 stops of compensation with 3 image stabilization modes. It's going to be very reliable for photography if you're handheld photography, maybe on a car and it's moving around or on a boat, as well as I think it will fix a lot of those micro jitters that you can sometimes get when you're using it for video on a tripod. But a lot of the new modern mirrorless lenses are going to have better image stabilization. I know the new 600mm actually have up to 8 stops of compensation when you couple it with a modern mirrorless IBIS camera, like for example the R5 Mark II or R1. So if image stabilization and autofocus is a big determining factor, I think a new, more modern mirrorless lens might outperform it. But for a DSLR lens, I still think it's got one of the best autofocus and image stabilizations I've seen. Right guys, so it's that time of the video where we have a look at the overall pros and cons to really work out, is this lens actually worth investing in and is it worth a spot in your camera bag? Let's have a look at the pros first. First off, this lens has amazing build quality and arguably some of the best weather sealing money can buy. Doesn't matter where you're going in the world, this lens here can stand up to the challenge. In fact, I'm actually heading to Svalbard in May, which is the most northerly town in the world, hopefully photographing some walruses as well as hopefully some polar bears. This lens here would be ideal for a situation like that. This lens also offers you amazing image quality, incredibly sharp, and one of my favourite lenses for sports and wildlife photography. You've also got an incredibly bright aperture of f2.8, the brightest aperture super telephoto prime lens currently on the market. You've also got really fast and reliable autofocus. Granted, you, not the fastest I've ever seen, but still fast enough to keep up with even fast-moving subjects. You've also got very reliable image stabilization, which is great for handheld photography and also video if you're planning on wanting to use this lens on a tripod. So as you can see, there's a plenty of pros to think about, but it wouldn't be fair just to look at the pros. So let's really round this review off and have a look at a few of the cons of this lens. Although it's the smallest 400mm, it is still a massive lens and will take up a considerable amount of room in your camera bag. So if you are flying, you might be worth maybe bringing a more versatile, smaller zoom lens, because otherwise you're not gonna be able to bring any clothes with you due to the size of this lens. Although it still might be worth it. And of course, who can forget the incredibly high price point, being over £13,000 or around $12,000, out of budget for, I would say, around about 99% of photographers. So this lens here has been one of my most anticipated lenses I've been wanting to review for basically since I started my YouTube channel. I've always wanted to test a 400mm f2.8, but did it live up to my expectations? I would say so. It was amazing to use. I loved the image quality of this lens, and that aperture was so nice to use in a low light environment. I photographed both sunrise with the red deer and also sunrise with the grey seals, and I loved the image quality for that, both for photography and video. But would I recommend buying it? Hell no. This is way too expensive to actually purchase. But what I would recommend is actually rent this lens. In fact, I'm probably gonna rent it for the foreseeable future. Every time I go on a photography trip, I'll probably just rent it, because £13,000 or around $12,000 is far too expensive unless you're a working professional that will use this day in, day out, or maybe you just work in an area where wildlife is just abundant and you can always photograph it and make some serious money. Then to be honest with you, I just recommend renting a lens like this. In fact, I know a lot of the sports and wildlife photographers that use this lens regularly don't actually own it. They either permanently loan it from a company and they can hand it back whenever they want, or they just simply rent it for a weekend, and it's something I always highly recommend. And with an overall score of 41 out of 50, this is actually the best performing super telephoto prime lens I've reviewed on this channel. Thank you to all of my YouTube members that are currently supporting the channel. If you guys want to support the channel and get some awesome perks, including free Lightroom presets, make sure to go ahead to the link in the description. Also, thank you so much for Canon UK for loaning me this lens for around 2 weeks. It was an absolute blast to use, so thank you very much. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.